Good evening, friends. And it really is all friends in the gathering. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. We are going to release this wonderful book by TV Santhosh, who all of you saw the exhibition that we presented in the special project space next door. And it was really a remarkable exhibition. And I have to thank Santhosh and Shalini. Where's Shalini? Shalini's here. Shalini, come in the front. But you have to come to release the book. No, I think we need somebody. We have to have you because you really are the person who has been was telling me for a long time, we need to do a show of Santhosh. I would really like to do a show of Santhosh. And then, of course, she shared the images with me. And that's how it then all happened. And she is really the quiet force behind all the wonderful activities that McGill does, and behind this book, which is really a remarkable publication, which all of you must see it and purchase it. Santhosh will be signing the book next door in our shop, and I would highly recommend that that if you can, you should get the book. It's a book that has not only remarkable, wonderful images, but it is also it includes several very fine essays by highly regarded and respected critics. And so it's a wonderful document, a kind of archive of an artistic practice, which is what we so much need in our country. There is so little documentation that is done about artistic practice, and it's great that you have done this, Shalini. It is more than anyone else, you who need to be congratulated. And I really think you should come up front, at least to open the book, to be with us while we open the book. And may I request Sudhir? Yes, Sudhir, why don't you are the most loved among us, let us say. Come. and you must honor. I'm sure Santhosh would be delighted if you came. So please honor us and come to the stage and please release the book. Yeah. You can present the book to both of them, to Santhosh, of course, but also to the So I think we can start the conversation now. So all of you, of course, are familiar with Santhosh's practice, which is really a practice of resistance, a practice that is very nuanced and has many registers to it. And I went through all the articles of the book and I thought, now what are the things that have not come up or are persistent through the book that we should explore more? And so, Santhosh, I wanted to start with your very formative and important early years before you joined art school in Kerala in Thrissur. You were an activist and you felt very strongly about what you considered to be injustices in the system. Could you talk a little bit about that, what were those injustices that you experienced or that you became aware of and you felt that you must address? And when did it really begin to, when did you decide, okay, I want to do it to address these injustices through art? And then you went to art school. How did that process sort of evolve?
Hello. Yeah, I'm sorry. I will take a little time to warm up. It has been a long journey, and had gone through several, stages of changes, both conceptual and ideological, understanding of it. Uh, in my case, actually, when I finished my 10th standard, I directly went and joined one of the small art institute in Kerala, in Trichy, actually. So that time, it was just an usual art institute where there is no art history. You know, there were very few teachers who really taught about what is happening in the contemporary art scene. And there are no any theory classes. So it was just meant for the merely developing kind of a craftsmanship and, finding a kind of a job, that was just there. That institute just provided kind of a certificate. Even it's a diploma certificate, also some kind of a certificate which is not nationally valid at that point of time. So it is the first time that our batch actually in Kerala, that started a kind of a strike in order to change the curriculum and start the BFA and MFA and all kind of things. And the strike went on for a long time. We boycotted the classes and picket, the teachers and all that. But we lost a lot of time in the process. We even had to go to the police station and spend time in lockups and all that. So probably it's all started from there. And it was nothing planned or anything like that. And we, in a way, came in contact with one of the activist kind of a person. His name is Civic Chandra in that time. He had started some kind of an alternative magazine addressing various contemporary issues. So he came and asked various kind of helps, doing posters and typography and all kind of, even sometimes illustrations and all that. So we said, okay, we can do that. That is how it's all started. So we used to go to him, and there will be a lot of people coming into that office, mostly very important persons from that period, actually, cultural situation. Some of them are, artists, some of them were, activists. So there were a lot of programs. And main thing was that they had an organization called Pradikarna Sangham, and they had different sub branches which dealt with the different issues issues, something to do with, suppose if it's environmental issues, then they had a different branch of it. If it has something to do with mental patients, because we had a mental hospital in Thrissur that time. So every Thursday we used to visit the mental hospital, and we used to do all kind of things, whatever is needed at that point of time, because that time the condition of mental hospital was so bad actually. Even the quality of food, the cleanliness of the rooms, starting from in all levels. So we had a kind of supervised all the activities over there, and even talk to them, or even try to be a good listener. We let ourselves to be in front of those patients and ask them to tell their stories. So there were a lot of such stories that we could hear, and we even set up a entertainment system, in the sense that time radio was the only available form of such kind of medium. So we set up a radio with different speakers that connect to all the rooms over there, and even set up a library. And we cleaned, we look after the quality of food. Even one of the important job that I had to do was to paint pictures, so that we can put pictures in every room of the inmates mental hospital. So I painted, I remember that I had painted so many pictures, as something you might say beautiful pictures, something that is not anything depressing or disturbing or anything. The images might have a sense of healing touch or something like that. So, this is one kind of activity that every week on Thursday we used to do. But there are so many other activities, in the sense there were a separate branch for the literary activities. We used to call important writers to the institute. So this kind of activity used to be always after the classes. So I was the person who is responsible of opening the gates and arranging places for them to sit and all that. But that time there are no chairs or anything. We used to sit on in the sand only at that time. But I remember important writers like Anand Kovil. That time Malayalam literature, and Anand was very important writer. Even still he is very important writer. Even many ways he have even influenced my way of thinking also. So gradually I was being part of their various kind of activities, and one of the important activity that on an everyday basis that I had to do was to do the posters. There will be always something happening, and we had to address that, in some form. So the posters were the easiest way that you can communicate with the very common public out there. So our job was text always somebody else will provide us, and I used to write the posters, and in the middle of the night we used to carry the posters and what you call the maida, for sticking the posters in and around the city in the wee hours, that all that, even the street theater, that was another thing. Yeah.
I just want to take off from what you said, the experience of being in this mental hospital and having to, mediate their reality in a sense. And your paintings are really your effort to mediate a sort of larger reality, in a sense. It reflects a subjective reality that is informed by your experience of being an activist and a member of a protest group, and an objective reality of a dystopian world that is shaped by forces beyond your control, like technology and media. There is a tension between these internal and external forces in your painting. And in a way, your paintings are a sense of ordering this chaos. And you have talked about reality being an inscribed reality through media. But there is another layer that I'm hearing from you, which is this reality of interacting with people who have a different sense of consciousness and understanding and trying to reach out and help them through that. And your effort to make paintings that they could put up on their walls, which would be a sort of therapeutic effect for them. So it adds a whole nother register to what is sort of well known and written, and that's quite fascinating. So tell us a little bit about this sense of you're negotiating with this mediated reality. How did you became conscious of it through your exposure to radio? You talked about television had just come, I think, at that time, and your early experience of television, and then the idea of media performing a negative role, really, not a positive role.
Yeah, actually, and whatever I am doing today, or the kind of understanding of supposedly the kind of art, that one I can trace it back to the kind of experiences that I had in Kerala. The interesting thing is that whatever I had learned when I was studying in Thrissur, I keep on rechecking whether those lessons that I had learned at that point of time is really relevant or really still valid. Because things have been changing. The reality is not anymore the same. It is not the same 80s, and the world has completely changed. So even when I am doing works today, I realize that there is always a process of turning back and finding or rediscovering certain elements that I had done long time back. And I realized that still those elements have still a lot of relevances. And that in a way sort of give me some kind of assurance or some kind of form of revalidating my understanding of what is, reality and what is art and all. Such complex question one can keep on ask. You asked me about the idea of news reportage, for example. So that time in Kerala when I was there, we had an idea that whatever is coming in the newspaper are not really true. They are always kind of manipulated facts, putting on the front page. Because there is always some different kind of power game that is happening. So we, in a way, or me, in a way, had a feeling that media is not really always telling you what is actually happening. Media is actually telling you something that, is always sort of manipulated. So I realize that the media have the potentiality to manipulate our understanding of what is reality. So that idea actually starts from the kind of act. Yeah.
That is reflected in your painting.
One of the core idea of all the works probably I have done. And I was basically looking at how can you make it into a visual practice. Because idea is there, definitely idea is there, but how can you make it into a painting, addressing the same issues with a lot of concerns. And so that anyway, it's I know that it's not an easy job to do because always there are thousands of questions, hundreds of questions that you have to always keep on, addressing through your work. So, so the search is in various level in the sense there is a search that through the imageries that everyday basis that you are encountering. And there is a process of, the visual practice, which not necessarily all the time, correlate with the idea that you have in your mind. So you have to find always some connection or some kind of an aspect that validate the kind of process that you are doing. So there is always an element of accidents, element of unexpected revelations in the process. So when I came to Bombay around 2000, then I was basically looking at Second World War photography, especially black and white photography. Then
you need to hold it.
Yeah. Then I started using those black and white photographs in my works, and I was in a way trying to ask questions why there is always war happening in this world, and what are the reasons behind it, and what are the kind of strategies being employed in order to achieve a particular kind of aim or target. The people who are behind the war or the violence. So my work is a kind of investigation into the process of understanding the aspect of war and violence. But I started with the Second World War images of black and white photography, but then it went on. And there are probably a number of changes that happen in between. And every changes do have some kind of an interesting, correlation with the kind of ideological position that I had to take in various situations.
So your protagonist is, and especially in the exhibition that we presented at the Bhau Daji Lad, it's a very kind of strong, powerful, singular image. Is he a martyr, a victim, a prophet? Is he the artist? I know you had your studio assistants were some of the actual models, but the point is, what does he represent to the viewer, to the world? His position is a very strong, and in some cases a very where he is just where death is obviously there and implied, but in some cases, or it's a very assertive kind of an image. So who is this protagonist? You have talked about the artist as being prophetic, and you have talked about and you have said, I have choreographed his acts, the acts of the protagonist, in order to shift his identity through history and its landmark events. So it's not clear that he has a definitive identity. I think his identity mutates with different representations. But at the core, who would you say this is? Is he you?
You can kind of can say it's my self-image, or a kind of an autobiographical image. Because it's how come I came to this stage of using my self-image. I am not directly using it, but it's supposed to be a person who keep on watching out what is happening around. Somebody who is quite sensitive about what is happening around. So it's not always necessarily that it has to be me or somebody who could be, similar to
stands in for the artist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's a witness to all the.
He's a witness, right?
Yeah, he's a witness, and mostly the kind of images that I have chosen is generally is from a victim's point of view. But not always necessarily that I have stick with this idea of the victim. But there are aggressors also, and sometimes it can be very complex also. For example, there is one painting where a person is standing and holding a knife back of his. So the interesting thing is that actually this image comes from a totally different reference point. It's actually coming from a movie where I had to respond to one of the movie in Kerala they were producing, and they were planning to do a kind of a fundraising exhibition. So they were asking for a painting, So they wanted something that connects with the movie. So they showed us the movie before the movie got released. So there is a character in that movie who is a traditional healer. He belongs to a particular community, and his job is to self-inflict the pain, by cutting his own body or scratching his own body with a knife. By doing that, he's probably trying to invoke the divine into him, so that he might, it's almost like a shamanic act or something like a oracle will do in some of the ritualistic tradition which Kerala have. And he's a kind of a healer. By doing that, he invoking the god and trying to get the divine, supposedly divine power in order to heal the people. So there is this element of healing in that, the very act of it. That's why I had done two different versions of the same painting. In one of the image, you have a halo behind that person. But the second one, there is no halo and there is no wounds behind it. But when you remove the halo and when you remove the scratch mark or the wounds, suddenly the meaning changes.
Yeah.
So instead of the healer or instead of the victim, he become the aggressor, automatically. He become the high, the one who inflict the pain into the society. So this changing of the role with the changing of few elements in the painting can do completely different visual impact.
Visual impact.
This kind of practice, visual exercises, are there in almost every painting probably. So it's not an easy question that one can ask, or it's not an easy answer one can do. Because because when I was in Kerala, we used to ask the question, what is the real purpose of art or art making? So being in the community of leftist-oriented intellectual people, we always say that the art have the kind of purpose of social reconstruction, or it can even work as a kind of form of resistance. But they never touched upon the idea which traditionally or from the different kind of spiritual tradition, they would say that art have got a function of healing people. Like most of the traditional folk art forms in Kerala have that. For example, Theyyam form of art in Kerala, that's a folk tradition or traditional form of art, which is actually meant for healing people. Actually, you can people go to it's almost like an oracle or a shaman. You go to him, and he provide all the solutions. He gives suggestions, or even console the people, saying that nothing will happen to you, that kind of assurance. So can the painting do that kind of a job also? So I was in a way trying to jump between this idea of the resistance and the idea of healing. Especially this watercolor painting, the recent watercolor painting, I tried to balance between these two, both the form of resistance and form of healing. And also there are many other questions. For example, many people used to ask me, because the previous series of work when I was doing, even I would think myself, because I am basically addressing the issues, but I was never providing a solution. Maybe providing a solution is not an artist's job, because that's not even probably the purpose of contemporary art or the kind of art that we all do. But I was thinking that if at all, if there is a possibility, is it possible to do even in my work? So I was thinking that if it all possible, what are the kind of methodology by which you can do that? Because you are not, the medium that you are doing is a visual medium, and you have to deal that issue through images, not by the verbal ideas. So it has to be there in the work. And the work should generate that idea, not necessarily that you impose an idea onto the work. So there are all this, one can really read into it actually, because there is this contradiction between the central image where the protagonist is actually trying to address the turbulent reality in which he lives. And the background of it is the element of healing, where you have all these botanical imageries which have a
therapeutic
aspect.
So talking about that, talking about the visual quality of your work, what about the color yellow? So how does that work? Because it is not, as we discussed earlier, it is not an inviting yellow. It's more a yellow, which is, it's a difficult yellow. It's not psychedelic, but it has a tinge of green in it, and so it's slightly intimidating. So it's interesting because normally the color yellow is a very inviting color. It obviously represents light, the sun, etc. But here you've changed its character completely.
Yeah, it's visual language is very complex, and the images are more complex in that sense. So you cannot really give a 100% perfect answer to the questions all the time. So pardon me on that, but how did this? Well, how did it started? I can tell you, because this the first painting in this series, when I had done it in acrylic on canvas actually. That painting was done specifically for one of the shows curated by both Shalini and Baiju Parthan for Gill Art Gallery. And it was called Graffiti or something. And in that show, the artists were, given freedom to paint like a graffiti artist. They can stay over the night, overnight in the gallery and paint like a graffiti artist with the spray paint and all that. So, but also you had freedom to choose whichever material. You can also take canvas, or you can directly paint on the wall. So I had taken canvas instead of directly painting on the wall like many other graffiti artists would do generally. So why did I take canvas? It's a matter of convenience, because you don't have to gallery and stay overnight. That was one reason. And another reason was asking the question about what is actually graffiti. What is the purpose of doing a graffiti in a gallery space? Because no ordinary layman or the common public come to the gallery. So if you do a canvas, you can take it outside the gallery house. You can take it to wherever you want. So that is one idea. And also the idea is that graffiti do really have a language of its own? What does actually graffiti mean? Anything you do on a public space or public wall can be considered as graffiti. But if you do it in a gallery space, can you call it as a graffiti? And if you are doing it on a gallery space, can you retain the idea of gravity or the quality of gravity? That is the fundamental question that I have been asking. So I had to understand that the graffiti seems to have some kind of a methodology of its own, and it is basically meant to address issues and directly speak to the very common people on the road. So you need to have a kind of a language that can be easily understood by the common people without really problematizing the whole aspect of it. So I thought I should have an image which is lucid enough to be communicated with the people. And also I need not only just the image, but a supporting text, because normally all the political posters will be having a combination of text and image. So the text will be helping the image to read in a way that gives another dimension to the images, reading of the image. So that is how I started. So I thought that I will follow the language of political posters. And especially then I was looking at, I had done a lot of posters back in Kerala. And I was looking at the especially the Russian posters, propaganda, communist era propaganda posters. Then I was trying to understand what is the kind of the language, the very language and the methods of making a poster. So one of the aspects is that all these political posters will be having a very blank background, very bright background. So that is how a bright background comes. And technically speaking, lemon yellow is the color that I am using. That is one of the color you can paint a background without any patches. It's very technical in the sense, but also it in a way allows you to follow the language or the language of a poster making, especially political poster. That is how this aspect of yellow comes. But then if you want to really find a meaning of yellow in relation to the images that I have painted, then there is a lot of possibilities in that. Mm-hmm. It is on the one way, as you said, it is not a pleasant, not necessarily all the time very pleasant. Sometimes it can be very disturbing also. Sometimes it can, because it's the botanical images that you have, and this because all these botanical images, why I painted the botanical images is is in order to create a medicinal garden.
Right.
Yeah. So that is how this you can sort of correlate this meaning of yellow and also the irony of using yellow. All can be, you can read it in the painting.
Right. So that brings me to another observation that I made, which is that you are I think that you are influenced by, 15th, 16th century Dutch art, which, as you know, was the paintings described a reality, but there was a lot of symbolism in it. The different objects meant different things, and they became a well-known trope that people could look at the painting and immediately realize what the artist was trying to say as well. And you have mentioned in one of the interviews how the Peter Bruegel's Christ Carrying the Cross, 1554, how 1564, sorry, how that painting sort of really moved you in a way, because it's about Christ, but the figure of Christ is almost hidden in the crowd, and you have to really go through the whole painting, as you mentioned, to find Christ, and then really look at it closely to understand its meaning. So and also, I think your palette, the very monotone palette that you have, that in early Dutch art, that was an important trope of keeping it very subdued and very monotone. And tell me is that a correct observation?
That Dutch connection, that it's even I am not really aware.
Okay.
It is not many people have even pointed out that there is, but monochrome definitely is there, because but Dutch art in various ways definitely have influenced almost all the artists in various ways. Peter Bruegel, one of my favorite painter. I think he's a master actually. why I had talked about Peter Bruegel's painting in that interview was mainly because, how you can understand a painting without the help of understanding the history behind it, or without understanding the textual aspect of behind the painting. How a painting directly communicates with you. Sometimes even the text can mislead a painting's meaning, in some cases, not always necessarily. So this was some kind of an experiment that I had done long time back in Kerala with one of my non-artist friend, because I was basically looking at Bruegel's painting. And even myself also got shocked, because I was, that time it was for the first time I was looking at Bruegel's painting. And I realized that he's completely different from the rest of the European painters, especially the Florentine, Renaissance painters. And the whole ideology and philosophy behind the painting is completely different. It doesn't really go with the Renaissance tradition. It's completely different. So, I mean, this thing I came to know much later, because that time I didn't know English and all that. So I read about it much later. But that time my idea was that how can you locate Christ's image in that particular painting? Because in that painting there are more than 360 figures are there. And Christ image is also as insignificant as rest of the human figures in that painting. It is totally unlike the other Florentine and Italian tradition, where the Christ image will be one of the image dominating the whole painting. And here the very process of finding the Christ took long time for my friend. It took long time, and finally he didn't find that. So I realized that even this process of looking at the painting is also contribute to the very meaning of the painting.
Right.
Because it's a journey, because you have to travel. There is a possibility of traveling through the painting. And if a painting have the possibility of traveling through the spaces that the artists have,
and that's what you do in your painting.
Yeah. So that
you're asking the viewer to travel.
If that possible, but Bruegel's painting definitely narrative painting, but without really going through that sense of a narration.
Right.
How you can possibly do a chance of traveling, or a possibility of traveling through the painting. That's one of the elements. Probably you can trace it back.
Okay, so let's talk, which was an important part of the exhibition that we had. Your use of bones and prosthetic limbs. You describe a kind of wasted landscape, material excess. But at the same time, you have done it in a material which is wood, which is a very sensuous, a very warm material. In a sense, it is negotiating this horror that you have, sort of presented us with, which is, it's a kind of, very difficult to be able to absorb that. And you have mediated it through this aesthetic of beauty. And I also spoke to you about that I think that the trope of beauty in your work is a very important trope. It becomes a way of mediating this very stark the sense of horror that is present and that is certainly in your work, imminent in your work, but you use this photorealism and this very very captivating kind of visual language to, and then material in the case of sculpture, to mediate that horror. And therefore beauty becomes this very interesting trope, which is almost like a palliative.
Yeah, it's a beauty is a very complex thing. Actually, there are multiple ways you can address that idea. I mean, almost all the artists have probably faced with this idea of beauty. I remember a long time back in Kerala, there was a very important artist. His name was M.V. Devan. He's a director, disciple of K.C.S. Panikkar. He's a wonderful artist, also a thinker, writer, and all that. So he had written a small article, a preface to another book, in which he have tried to address a small or interesting issue. For example, how can you translate aesthetics into Indian language? The term aesthetics in the Indian language. So we generally say it in Indian language, Saundarya Shastram. In Malayalam, we say Saundarya Shastram. Saundaryam means beauty. But then he said that that's not the correct translation. Aesthetic is something else. Then he replaced with another word, which is something very close to that, which is Lavanya Darshanam. So you can almost, instead of using Saundarya Darshana, you can almost use Lavanya Darshana for the same purpose. So he tried to explain what is the meaning of Lavanya Darshanam. He said that Lavanya, the term comes from Lavanam. Lavanam in Malayalam or in Sanskrit is called salt. And it is the Darshanam means it's a vision, the vision of salt. That is the direct meaning of it. But he said that what is the purpose of using salt in cooking and all that? We all know that what is the purpose of using the salt in all kind of cooking. It's to create a kind of a balanced taste. But he said that what as a material, what does salt do? He say it melts. It melts in water, and if you put it in any food, it absorbs. So this two different acts. One is melting and getting absorbed into various things it put into. So he said that melting, in Malayalam, if you say melting, it means it has got a word called, alive, sorry to say all these things. So alive has got a direct meaning, which is compassion. So anything that melts, if the heart melts, even when you look at a painting, that is actually because you are compassionate to that particular thing. Right? If anything that melts or make you compassionate enough, that there is beauty in it. So the very fundamental purpose of art is to make you sensitive and compassionate. So if an art form have that possibility of doing it, then it is beautiful. So this idea of beauty can be, even applied to my oldest born sculptures that I had. Apart from it, I also got a different kind of history behind it. And even if you really go into the history behind why there are chapels decorated with bones, even any place in Rome and Prague and all that, you have chapels, beautiful chapels decorated with human bones.
Mm.
There is still mystery behind why such chapels are decorated with the bones. Another very interesting aspect is that even in India, especially in Manipur and all that, I hear that if a terrible massacre happens, then they have a tradition of collecting the bones of all the people who have died in that genocide or whatever. They will collect the bones and they will make it into a monument so that people will be able to come there and pray for the people who have died in that process. Also pray for their own people who have died. So this become kind of a monument for prayer, because that I have done one large installation where it's even called room to pray. It's a kind of a monument of bones where you can go and pray, not necessarily for your own benefit, but for the benefit of society at large. Yeah. So that prayer is basically rooted in the idea of compassion, and it is then connected to the idea of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, on that note, we are almost at 7, or I think just past 7, and I wanted to open it up to the audience because I have many other questions, but I think it will go on to. It's fascinating, the whole your frame of reference and how that is inflected in your art, how it comes through, and how you create this alternate universe in a sense, your sense of ordering the universe. Would anybody like to ask some questions? Come on. Everybody's so overwhelmed with the... Please, just we'll give you the mic.
I was quite moved. At the start, you began with your influences in a hospital environment, etc., and this healing element, the element of resilience and healing, and what role the artist can play. And this idea of this salt and sort of melting and compassion, it's a very moving idea, I think, for healing, if you can achieve it. I find it, that is the challenge of being able to melt people's heart. For an artist, I think that is a wonderful thing. That's from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a very nice statement. It's not a question, so hope. I don't know whether I answered to your questions properly or not.
Yes, of course.
I think just
you went much beyond. I think what is
rather.
Yes, I think what is so moving is exactly what Amit said. Is that it brings in this sort of deep, sort of indigenous forms of thought and thinking, and it sort of really transforms the understanding of the paintings.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. And some of what you are saying today is actually not in. I read almost every article and all the interviews, And it is not in any.
I haven't said many things.
Yes. So which really brings a different kind of perspective.
The answers are not always complete. Even though the questions are very simple. Because you asked me about the horror of using the images of bones, but I talked about the beauty of it. So then I haven't really answered to your question.
No, you have.
But there is then definitely a possibility of then talking about the horror of it also. In the sense, there are a long history behind it. All those catacombs and killing fields, and all those totally different kind of a history there is behind it. So when I do a work, I realize that it is not always necessary. You can, limit its meaning to one corner of it, but it can have a lot of possibility of reading into it, because there are multiple ways of looking at work. So all the answers that I have told you right now, it's all incomplete answers in that sense.
No, they're not at all. They're incomplete in the sense of the potential to say so much more, and which is so insightful. So then I'll ask you another question, while some of you think about what you might like to ask, and you've talked about the therapeutic effect, especially of your of the plants, of the foliage in the backdrop of your paintings, and that they are medicinal plants. So is that a trope, or does it suggest a return to a pastoral world? Is that your kind of suggestion, or is that an indication that you want to give your viewer that these are medicinal plants, but they're also a very strong backdrop to your work, and they suggest nature and an engagement with nature and a pastoral world, a more gentle, a more Gandhian view of life, rather than this crazy technological, which you have commented about, of course, and which is there also in your work. This sort of, this kind of technological race that we are in, to sort of get more and more advanced and do better and better, and where is it taking us? And you, in a sense, seem to suggest that we need to think and stop, and the plants, in a sense, kind of impute that kind of suggestion. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's completely right, actually. Yeah, it's many of my works directly or indirectly address this issue of the idea of progress. We always associate the idea of progress with technological progress. Like modern medicine, even the technology also possibly can have side effects. And that is what today we see in the form of global warming and a lot of ecological disasters that's happening. And also you can even read the whole history, how the technology progress and how the war also changed accordingly. The weapon technology in relation to the war, and how much damage can create, with the simple pressing of a button, a nuclear explosion and all that. So one can see a lot of parallels between the technological progress and the idea of, the development of, or the changes of, or the nature of war that is happening all around. So that's very much there, actually. So, but it's a highly vicious circle. In the sense, like I had told you, that I have been very much influenced by one of the writer in Kerala. His name is Anand. He is a thinker and novelist and all that. Long time back, he had said a very interesting story. It's a Greek mythological story. It's you all know that Minotaur, half man and half bull image. That Minotaur is a very interesting myth in Greek mythology. He was a very violent character. And his father is supposed to be a brilliant architect in the story. Yeah. So in order to trap Minotaur, the architect father made a labyrinth so that the Minotaur have enough freedom to move around, but at the same time he will be trapped inside the labyrinth. He made a complex labyrinth, and he kept on expanding that labyrinth. And in the process, it says that at the end of it, even the architect himself got trapped in it. It's a very, very interesting story. It's talk about the whole humanity and how man's own knowledge, scientific knowledge, trapped our own, race. We are basically trapped in our own understanding of the very nature of. So this, I think it's a very, even though it's simple story, very symbolic to whatever is happening today. We are basically trapped by our own knowledge, actually. Even though we feel very proud of our understanding and scientific development, and but we are basically victim of our own knowledge.
True. It's true also at a psychological level. It's true both as a subjective and as an objective reality. Okay. Anybody? Yeah, Sudhir, please.
You mentioned earlier that there was a phase when you were jumping between resistance and empathy, or resistance and
Feeling.
yeah. So how do you see the relationship between this? I mean, it seems that if there is if you're representing resistance or want to show resistance, the image is addressing someone differently than when you are wanting it to evoke empathy. So the audience that you're addressing is in a sense different. So, but in your later work, there seems to be a coming together of, I mean, the images of what are in fact images that suggest resistance to violence, and at the same time the images also evoke empathy. So was there a period when you were looking at this as coming together, or has it remained like a 2 points?
There are different high points and there are a lot of fluctuations. Anyway, ultimately the underlying aspect of resistance is again compassion. It's because of compassion that we take a method or methodology of resistance or protest, form of protest, things like that. So if you look at it from a larger humanistic point of view, then there is no conflict. But we look at it very closely, each incident or each episodes in relation to the kind of work that we produce, then maybe there's a chance of, finding a lot of contradictions and conflict. But from a larger perspective, both resistance and healing, both are evolved out of or generated out of compassion towards our fellow being. In that sense, there is no conflict here. But only thing is that sometimes the form of resistance can be very violent. But through art, it is not possible, because even we are portraying violence, it is not still violent, because it's still, creative process which doesn't disturb. Maybe emotionally it may be provoking or disturbing somebody, but since its underlying aspect is compassion towards the fellow being, it is not really doing any harm in that sense, actually. So, in a larger perspective, if you look at from a larger perspective, there is no contradiction, such. But when you look at each painting, then there is, a conflict between these two processes. I don't know whether it's.
No, it's very well put. Yeah.
Many people had asked me, because the idea of resistance is mostly a leftist-oriented approach. The idea of healing is mostly very traditional and spiritual-oriented approach. So, in Kerala, there are two different poles up. They don't, spiritual people and communist people doesn't. I mean, they are totally opposite in that sense. They don't agree each other. But I feel that since, as I said before, both are basically based on the compassion, there are no contradiction. Only in some cases, some issue, you have to look at each episodes of incident that happened, wherever there is a protest happened and methods of violence have been used in order to achieve a certain aim. Then maybe you'll find problems, but in a larger perspective, maybe the ultimate intention probably could be to bring, love and peace. In that sense, maybe we can find it okay.
Would anybody else like to make a comment or to ask a question? No? So then we can all go to the shop, and Santhosh will sign books. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And I hope you've enjoyed the evening. And thank you again, Shalini, and thank you, Sudhir, for doing us the honors. And thank you, Santhosh, for these wonderful insights.
Thank you for very interesting questions.
Yeah. Thank you.